This is another in a series of occasional lectures on the basics of journalism. A previous lecture was called The Perfect Sentence. This lecture is called The Perfect Interview. The earlier lecture was about how you present the information. The sentence is the basic unit of communication in the English language and in many other languages. And it's something journalists are supposed to be good at, speaking and writing in concise language. So this lecture is more about the gathering of the information. There are two sides to the job of a journalist: to find out what's happening and to let his readers, listeners and viewers know about it in languages and formats they can understand. This is summarised in two verbs: to inquire and to inform. For some reason, the journalists in the mainstream failed to practice even the most basic skills of our trade throughout the COVID project. So journalism is not just complicit in the success of the COVID project, it is front and centre. And that's a good enough reason for me to give lectures on the basics of journalism and to welcome into our midst the new journalists who filled the void: Richie, Scotty, Andrew, Andy, Alan, Robin, Michael, Andrew too, yeah. I don't want to make this too adults only, but although we're all adults here, but it's certainly, it was a mystery to me, and I tried to find out why journalists did not do their jobs 6 years ago when this COVID story was breaking. Because you could smell the bullshit 100 miles away. And there are certain basic rules in the universe, like gravity. And one of them is that when you see the names of Fauci, Gates and Rockefeller in the same paragraph, you know somebody's about to steal your false teeth off the bedside table. I'm just going to reverse the order of things here, so I'll go straight into it. When Gough Whitlam was campaigning in Perth, in Western Australia, he and Margaret used to stay at the Travelodge, which was down at the eastern end of the terrace, the Causeway end. As I recall, it was on Terrace Drive looking over the Langley Park. It was good, it was informal. Because we had an early deadline, we went for an early interview. This is no problem when politicians are campaigning. They're looking for publicity. So the photographer and I would rock up early in the morning. I remember one morning in particular because I did a bad job. It still worries me. You know, I didn't do it well because I've been up all night reporting the State Parliament and I was really too tired. But the fact that I'm still bothered by that, this is going back to 1971 or 72, whenever, indicates that I took the job seriously. I took the job of reporting seriously. So it's early in the morning, Margaret's just out of the shower, she's wearing a long bathrobe, she's tall like Gough. Margaret Whitlam was a champion swimmer in her youth, and she always had an amused expression in her eyes. I suppose you need a good sense of humour when you're married to a politician. So she was having a piece of toast and drinking coffee, and Gough was on the phone talking to the comrades. And there were speech notes all over the floor from Graham Freudenberg. Graham Freudenberg wrote the big speeches for Gough Whitlam. And we all had a lot of time for Graham, even journalists on the right, who wrote for the finance pages and the mining and monthly business weeklies and monthlies. There were more magazines around those days. He was a very nice bloke to deal with, and he was a big picture guy. He was looking at what was going on in the world, not just what was going on in Canberra. By the same token, journalists on the left of centre, like me, had a lot of respect for Bill Mitchell, who wrote the big speeches for Dave Brand and Charlie Court. And Bill Mitchell was very much on the right, but the intelligent right. He was a true believer in American capitalism and that way. I think he was religious. He had that look about him, lean, aquiline features, but he never brought that into politics. Never brought religions into politics. The Liberal Party in those days, in its heyday, was run in Perth, was run by 4 very smart guys. They were all tall characters. There was Chilla Porter, the high jumper, who was the secretary, Charlie Court, Noel Crichton-Brown, and W.W. Mitchell, Bill Mitchell. Now, Bill Mitchell and I engaged in a war of words, conducted through the letters page of the West Australian newspaper, when the state government closed down the Fremantle Railway passenger service. You might remember this, late 1970s? And they replaced the trains with link buses that went down Stirling Highway, and the Transperth is still using these link buses. I caught a ride on one recently out to Midland. It was a beautiful new bus. I had a chat with the bus driver, very impressive engineering. Now, I opposed this policy, and Bill replied to me through the letters pages of the West Australian using the subsidy argument. This is classic right-wing economic argument, which was a sign of what was to come for the next 40 years. It was a subsidy argument. He argued that blokes like him who drove their Holdens everywhere, paid for their petrol, paid for their parking, were subsidising cheapskates like me who used public transport. So I replied, and I got a good spread in the West Australian letters page, that I was pleased to learn that W.W. Mitchell was subsidising my bus travel. I had no intention of paying him back. And this got a lot of laughs up and down St George's Terrace. More people read the West Australian in those days. I can't imagine anyone reading it now, and it wouldn't take you long if you did. It seems to be mostly about football and advertising. But the point is, in those days, only 50 years ago, it was possible, it was common, it was absolutely normal for people to have serious disagreement on significant items of politics and economics and to have a laugh about it, have a cup of tea, have a whiskey. We didn't have to call each other far right or radical left or peddlers of disinformation and misinformation. We could discuss these matters in a collegial way, which is the way you're supposed to discuss matters of politics and economics. And look at the people who are adjudicating whether we are far right or hate speech people. They are the most second-rate bunch of pox doctors clerks you've ever seen. They wouldn't know the right wing from the left testicle. The nice thing about Gough, one of the most controversial figures in Australian history, of course, was that every time I saw him, he always asked after my dad. Every time, even if it's just a few minutes to the airport. And when Gough Whitlam died, a lot of people commented on this. That he remembered who you were in terms of your family relationships. He left a lot of happy memories. When Malcolm Fraser was made the leader of the federal opposition in Canberra, leader of the Liberal Party, and then became leader of the opposition, and soon became another one of the most controversial figures in Australian history. We got the word that he would be making his first visit to Perth in that official capacity as leader, and he'd be arriving at Perth Airport in a light aircraft. The light aircraft in those days, at Perth, not Jandakot. So the light aircraft used to just park to the left of the terminal. So we were there to meet him, photographer and I, and the plane taxied in. He was coming. It was Jim Sampson's private aircraft from Esperance. Jim Sampson was the state president of the Liberal Party in those days. And the first thing I thought when we saw Malcolm Fraser get out of the plane was, how did he get into the bloody thing? He was all legs, very, very tall guy, Malcolm Fraser. So was Gough. Now, Malcolm Fraser had a very bad relationship with my mob, with the Press Gallery. I didn't realise how bad it was. I suppose he spoiled the party. They were having so much fun with Gough that when Fraser came along, it wasn't a lot of fun. But there was plenty of action, so that's what journalists like to see. They like to see lots of things happening. Now, I didn't realise how bad this was until 1978, it would have been, on the Queen's Jubilee tour. I talked about this back in November. The Queen and Duke arrived in Fremantle. The tour started in the Royal Britannia. This is a Jubilee tour after 25 years on the throne. So Elizabeth and the Duke arrived in Fremantle and went round Australia and departed Australia on a British Airways jumbo jet at Perth Airport. And a rumour had gone around Canberra that Sir John Kerr, the other most controversial character in the story, would be tendering his resignation to the Queen on this occasion. I didn't believe the rumour, because I think even Sir John Kerr, and certainly the protocol people I was working with, would have advised him, you don't rain on the Queen's parade. You can do that some other time. You don't want to steal her thunder. However, once a rumour gets going around Canberra, there's no stopping it. So we had on the tarmac at Perth Airport all the local media, Channel 7, the ABC and everyone, the Fleet Street media who travel around the world with the Queen on these tours and pump out stories and photographs of the royals, and the Canberra Press Gallery. And my job, I'd been seconded to the Premier's Department to liaise with the media, which meant I was mainly dealing with the police, and particularly at Perth Airport. There was this mob of photographers. They all wanted to get closer and closer to the plane. We were all on the tarmac. This is before we started looking for Arabs under the bed. We didn't have all the security stuff. Nowadays, we'd just be machine gunned, the whole lot of us, obviously terrorists. And so they wanted to get as close as they could. They always do. Photographers want to get as close as they can to see what's going on. And one of the journalists there was Jeff Kitney, who worked with us on the Daily News and went across to Canberra and stayed there for forever, and finished up with the Sydney Morning Herald. And he was a good reporter. He was tuned into Canberra. He had good ears. He knew what was going on in Canberra. And he told me that the Press Gallery hated Malcolm Fraser's guts. Those were exactly, they hated his guts. And I believed him. He was a good reporter. And I didn't approve, because it's a major mistake in political journalism to put too much focus on a personality. Even spectacular personalities like Gough Whitlam, Malcolm Fraser, Donald Trump, Pauline Hanson. Even spectacular pricks like Mark McGowan and old Misery Guts in Melbourne. Because when you do that, you lose sight of the direction of the policy. And that's what matters. The policy itself doesn't matter. You can buy a dozen policies for your local neighbourhood think wank anytime you like. So I didn't approve, and I'll come back to Malcolm Fraser. I corresponded with him in later years when all this drama was over. But Jeff Kipney told me that in Canberra, the clash between Malcolm Fraser and Gough Whitlam was titanic. I mean, it wasn't David versus Goliath. It was Goliath versus Goliath. And it sure as hell wasn't Albo versus, who's the new Liberal bloke? You know, I mean, who are they? Yeah. So it was a very, very dramatic time in Australian politics. And of course, a very exciting time for political reporters. And I always, the controversial character in all this is Rupert Murdoch, who originally backed Whitlam and then turned against him. And I've never met Murdoch, and we were talking about this with Michael Gray-Griffith and John Stapleton, who did work for Murdoch. And I said, I'm probably one of the few Murdoch virgins in Australian journalism. But I think Murdoch he really is a newspaper man, and his father before him. And I think he's basically a shit stirrer. You know, one thing newspapers don't like is peace and quiet, because they want stuff to write about. Our deputy editor used to look, what he wanted to see was a big strike, like a transport strike that goes on and on, because then people buy more newspapers. They want to know the latest on the strike. We call that a running story. And I think a lot of Murdoch's motivation is just stirring things up. You know, very naughty of him. But we tend to be that way. Now, the most famous interviewer in history was not Michael Parkinson, it was a German aristocrat, an officer and a gentleman whose job it was to interrogate all the RAF aircrew, pilots, navigators, who were shot down over Germany and occupied Europe in the Second World War. People like my dad. This is my dad's Oxford RAF squadron on the screen here. In the 1930s, in the period leading up to the Second World War, which they all knew was coming. Richie, how am I going there? Yeah, okay.
Going hard, keep going.
That's Dad, that's my dad. Now, a hell of a lot of these guys were shot down and killed in the Battle of Britain, flying their Spitfires and their Hurricanes. Dad wasn't one of them because he was put on another mission, which I'll go into. But so these men, they're all men. Don't see any girls there. This is 1930s girls, I'm afraid. You won't get much of a say in these scholarships. But these are the intellectual elites of the British Isles, the Empire, which we now call the Commonwealth, and the United States. One of Dad's mates was Paul Engle, the American poet, who set up the Iowa Writers' Workshop. My brother Paul was his godson. And Paul Engle used to say grace at our Thanksgiving Day dinners in Iowa City when I was a boy. I remember one of them, he said it was from the early settlers. I'm sure he wrote it himself, but it was about mush. He said, "Thank the Lord that we have mush enough." I used to sit next to Stephen Bush, who was the elderly professor of philosophy, who used to talk about travelling around Europe before the First World War, when they didn't have stuff like passports and so on. So we had an interesting childhood. These young men, they're in their blazers there, but they looked after their uniforms. And Dad still had bits of his RAF kit when we were kids. We used to play with it. In particular, he had a pair of shiny black lightweight, high-dress boots, high-legged, absolutely top of the wazzer, really, really fancy. And reluctantly, he allowed me to borrow them for a school play, high school play, first year. And my feet were bigger than Dad's, and I split the seam of one of these RAF boots. Was he pissed off? I've seldom seen him so angry. And he said terrible things about my feet. My feet were upset. In fact, I'm not convinced they ever recovered. When Dad wanted to go off for a weekend of ballroom dancing and high teas at the manor houses, the estates of one of their lordships, he'd borrow a plane, like one of these trainers, and fly off and land on the green fields of England and have the weekend with... This was the life of these intellectual leads. These were sensitive, highly educated, highly intelligent young men. And they were very much influenced by the events of the First World War and the Depression, 1931-32 Depression. Some of them turned to the left. They saw seriously, I mean, the destruction of capitalism was so great in 1914-18 and 1930 that they turned to communism, and they were recruited by the Soviets. The Cambridge Five are the best known, Philby and Co. It's a famous story. Others, like my dad, stuck with liberalism, with the British tradition, and they were recruited by Britain, by the Foreign Office, the British intelligence agencies. And during the long summer holidays, these students would hop across the channel to Europe. There's really not much more trouble than catching a ferry to Rottnest. And Dad was a deep student of fascism. This is one of his books. My New Order. We're familiar with new orders in the freedom movement. This one was written by a young bloke called Adolf Hitler. It's a secret. I know people who are deep students of fascism and they don't know about this book. Published in 1940 in New York. That's the level my old man was working on. And on one of these holiday jaunts to Europe, he was spying, of course, in Germany, and he was arrested. Now, he never told me about it, but my mother dropped it one day. Obviously got out of it somehow or other, sort of stuff you see in the novels. Would have been a swap, I guess. Let's, I'll just shift the photo here. That's Dad, that's my dad, before he knew about me. Yeah. He was a man of many talents, my old man. And this is a copper etching he drew, just trying out different forms of artwork. It's of a gold mine in Kalgoorlie. I'm not sure if it was his dad's gold mine. So my father's father, my grandfather, studied metallurgy at the School of Mines in Ballarat and came to Kalgoorlie as so many did in those days. Kalgoorlie was a big place. In the great days of the Golden Mile. Really bouncing place, Kalgoorlie. So my dad grew up in Kalgoorlie and Mount Barker. Let's go next one. Yeah. Weren't they stylish, those European fascists? The Americans try hard, but you can't really match a Cadillac against a Mercedes-Benz. You're not with it. When I wrote my story about our New World Order, Klaus Schwab's New World Order, I was delighted in the Light Australian newspaper. I was delighted when David and Lisa dug up one of these pictures of these two fine gentlemen. In that story, I quoted Giovanni Arrighi's Long 20th Century. So this idea of a new world order, where we're all going to be Superman and do what we're told, or go somewhere, or go to hell, is not new. Dad's mission that kept him out of the Battle of Britain was in the United States. Dad was sent to America the way these things are done, through the Foreign Office and so on. And I suppose you'd call him a sleeper in espionage, but his job was to bring America into the war on the British side. And that was the only game in town for the Poms, because they were looking pretty ugly when Hitler was heading their way. It went through France like a dose of salts. And Dad was the ideal candidate. He was steeped in the traditions of British liberalism and the Scottish Enlightenment. It was in his DNA for life. And he was a brilliant public speaker, but he wasn't a Pom. He was an American. Sorry, he was an Australian. And the Americans liked Australians. They still do. We have curiosity value. We play football with no shoulder pads. You guys play football with no padding. No padding. Gee. So, Dad loved America. And his posting was the Middle West, the American heartland, farming country, the state of Iowa. And he went back there after the war, and we were all born there. And the Americans loved him. And he would travel around the Midwest by train. Did the same thing after the war, made speeches. He got paid for them. He had 4 kids, so he had to make some money. But it was the same routine. I remember picking him up on snow everywhere. Mum must have been driving the old Chrysler. You had to keep the motor running for the heater to go, otherwise you'd be covered in ice. And one of the trains he used to catch was called the Rock Island Rocket. It was railways were a big deal in America in the 1950s. They may come back. So when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, Dad's job in America was over. The Americans went into the war in like Flint. So he was sent back to Australia. And in the process, he found himself in the bureaucracy of the American army. And he reckoned that was something else. It would make the Soviets look sort of well organized. So it took him a couple of weeks to get to Honolulu. He landed at Hickam Base. Hickam Airfield in Honolulu is next to Pearl Harbor. So it's a couple of weeks after the Pearl Harbor bombing. On our first trip to Australia in 1954, Dad showed us around Pearl Harbor, which is a sacred site for Americans to this day. Eventually, he got a lift to Australia from Hickam Field, they call it. Yeah, it was the U.S. Air Force. I think in the war was still part of the Army Air Force, but it would still be a U.S. Air Force base now in Hawaii. He got a lift to America on an American bomber. Lift to Australia on an American bomber. So there's just 2 guys on the plane, great big plane. Dad and the pilot sitting up in the cockpit. The pilot says to Dad, "Soldier, would you like to fly this plane?" And Dad says, "Yeah, you would, yeah." Well, he said, "Well, first you have to put on these earphones." So Dad puts on these earphones. And the pilot says, "Soldier, can you hear a sound in those earphones?" You know, typical Yank. Cool. Great big guy, 5 axe handles across the arse, full of hamburgers and milkshakes and stuff. And Dad says, yeah, I can hear a sound. And the pilot says, Well, that's good, because you can't hear a sound. We don't know where we are. So they were using a radio beam for navigation. This is late 1941, after Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was the 7th of December, 1941. On the 10th of December, 3 days later, Japanese aircraft sank the Prince of Wales and the Repulse in Malayan waters. And my mother was in Melbourne with her parents. She was nursing at Heidelberg Hospital at that stage. And all our trained guys were everywhere else. Anne's dad, Archer Eckersley, was in North Africa chasing Rommel around the desert, God knows why. And he was at El Alamein, which was later in 1942, August 1942. So Mum said it was just the lowest time. When the news came through of the Prince of Wales was the pride of the Royal Navy. Magnificent battleship, state of the art, a fabulous ship, and the Repulse was a major, big cruiser. And when that news came through Australia, with all our guys either in Europe or Britain or North Africa, all the trained men, people were really scared, with good reason. And the 15th of February, 1942, the British Army surrendered to the Japanese at Singapore, the greatest military defeat in the history of the British Empire. So this was what had always worried Curtin. Curtin's daughter said John Curtin, the Prime Minister, used to stand on the beach at Cottesloe, looking out and just saying, there's nothing to stop them. And there we were. So there's a very, very low point in Australia, the darkest point in Australian history. I'm making this story for a reason which I'll come to. We now know from the Japanese records of their war cabinet that there was a clash between the Japanese Navy, which wanted to invade Australia with a full-on invasion, and the bombardment of Darwin was a full-on naval aircraft carrier operation by the Japanese. I think it's downplayed to this day in Australia. But the Japanese army argued against it on the grounds that there was not enough merchant shipping to service the Australian divisions. And they were already stretched trying to keep up with their divisions in China. And the situation was resolved in the first week of May at the Battle of the Coral Sea. Now, people in my trade, parliamentary reporters, never die. We just sort of fade into the woodwork of the desks up around in the Parliamentary Gallery. We become sort of part of the history of the place. And even when, not that long ago, the reporters who covered the Parliament during the war were still active. They were still alive. And they were never in any doubt that the greatest speech in the history of the Parliament was on the eve of the Battle of the Coral Sea, when John Curtin addressed the House of Representatives. And if you look in the Hansard, it doesn't look much, but at the time, it was the occasion and the sincerity and the intelligence of John Curtin that just made everyone so aware. The Battle of Midway, a couple of months later, sort of was more decisive, but the Coral Sea stopped them. And after we came back to Australia, every year, my dad would introduce the guest speaker at the Curtin Memorial Lecture on the Memorial Day of the Battle of the Coral Sea, opening the Battle of the Coral Sea. So he was very tuned into that world, the world of geopolitics. This is going to be long. I'm going to get a bit worn out here, but yeah. So Dad's mission in Australia, which he continued for the rest of his life, was to work on the planning for the post-war relationship between Australia and America and Australia and Asia. Now here's John Curtin, the brainy Prime Minister in our history. At Australia's darkest hour was was still planning the post-war Australia and realising that we would have to get to know the neighbourhood. And it was Curtin who planned the post-war industrialisation of Australia, the Holdens and the Snowy River. He didn't live to see it, but it was implemented by Chifley and Menzies. And Dad really maintained this mission all his life. When we came back to Perth, he was at senior positions in the Australian Asian Association and the Australian American Association. And I used to go along to a lot of these meetings with him because my mother just got sick of going out every night of the week, you know. It's easy for blokes. We can look like something a dog dragged in and nobody cares. But women have to dress and they've got to do something with their hair. And I remember when Phil Pendle, my newspaper colleague, went into Parliament. He got into Parliament. He's got a ferry named after him that goes to South Perth, Philip Pendle. He was a very diligent member of Parliament. And we were at a party and all the women were talking to his wife, to Maxine. So, you know, they asked her, what do you do with your hair? Of course, blokes don't have to worry about it, especially blokes like me. And she was saying they often had to go out to 4 social functions in one night, being nice to people. So don't whinge too much about politicians. You wouldn't want to be one. Anyway, the best Australian Asian Association meeting I ever went to, and Mum came along too, there were 3 of us, was on the flight deck, the helicopter pad of a Japanese icebreaker, which was about to head down to the Antarctic. In Fremantle Harbour at sundown, on a perfect evening, the yachts were starting the naturalist race. And all around the flight deck were these delicious grills of Japanese food and gallons of warm rice wine. And I can safely say I've never been so well dined or pleasantly pissed in all my life. So I'm in favour of improved international relations. Anyway, let's have a look at my mother. This is an army propaganda photograph showing Lieutenant Reeford administering penicillin on the hospital ship Wanganella. Mum said that when penicillin was introduced during the war, it was a great help with wounded soldiers. So the Wanganella was a hospital ship. It was quite a big ship. I've got a picture of it here. That was brought into army service to pick up wounded Australian soldiers in the Pacific campaign. The place my mother talked about most was Bougainville. She said that was a really beautiful place. She would, I think she wanted to go back there. I don't think she ever did. I mean, she had 4 bloody kids and a demanding husband. So she never made it, I suppose. But she talked a lot about Bougainville. Now, later in the war, one of her patients was the dashing Oxford intellectual army intelligence captain Hugh Roberts. Poor bastard didn't stand a chance. There he was in a hospital bed on a hospital ship. What was he supposed to do, jump overboard? After the war, when there was time for that sort of thing, I was conceived on a hot summer's night on the front lawn of the Cottledale Civic Centre. So my mother was pregnant with me when they went to the United States on a converted Liberty ship that rolled around like a sick pig. So she spewed her way to the New World. We survived the experience, and I was born in the Mercy Hospital, Iowa City, Iowa, quickly followed by my 4 brothers. Our mother was sort of full-time pregnant in those years, and she blamed Dad, and Dad blamed her, but the problem was the marital bed was too small. And in those days of the post-war return to peacetime economy, they didn't have sheds full of new furniture and new fridges and king-size beds. So that was the problem. Let's go. That's the Wanganella. Now, Moira, a feisty lady in our freedom movement, told me all about the Wanganella. She was built at the Belfast shipyards where Moira's dad worked. She came out to Australia for the Tasman run, quite a substantial ship, as you can see. And Dad said, Mum said the captain was good. They had good crew, good people. They did a great job. And after the war, she went back to the Tasman run. And in the 1960s, Moira told me this story just recently, when her family had gone to New Zealand. There was a major construction project on the beautiful wild west coast of the South Island of New Zealand. And Utah Construction didn't have anywhere for their workforce. So the Wanganella finished her days as a hotel for the construction workforce. Go again. This is our beautiful young mother. One of the babies, the baby here is showing signs of early intelligence. So it's probably my brother Tom, who had the brains of the family. It couldn't be me. And I was a fat little pig too. But I think it's on the front lawn of the Lindquist house in Iowa City, sort of dress rose, Iowa City. Lynn Lindquist was one of Dad's professorial colleagues. Brilliant bloke. It's brilliant. It was a period in Dad's life where he was lucky. He told me later in life that he was never experienced again, but it was Camelot. It was a brilliant university in a small town in the United States. And I went to school there. It was the best school I ever went to. The school was under the umbrella of the University Education Department, and my dad was the professor of education, so I did have a bit of an advantage. But it was nice. A lot of kids were sons of professors and so on, and daughters, but they're also farm kids. So it was a nice mixture of kids and brilliant teaching, and everything was sort of the latest. And to go from grade 3 in the United States to grade 5 in Australia was like going back to Kensington, England. It was scary. But anyhow, Lynn Lindquist, he was one of these gadget guys. I can remember when he and Marg got the first air conditioner in Iowa City. And I can still see Marg sitting down with her what are those silly looking dogs? Poodle. Sitting down with her poodle in the air conditioner saying, and of course, because his kids were growing up and Dad's kids were young, Lynn Lindquist had more money. He used to drive a Buick V8. And what Dad really wanted was a 1955 Chrysler 300. 300 horsepower was a lot of horsepower in 1955. But he had 4 kids, so he had a second-hand Plymouth station wagon. And I remember him being so delighted, it might have been more recent years. Lynn Lindquist had the first of these garage doors that opens when you don't have to get out of your car. Everyone's got them now. But it's a radio beam and the garage door comes up. But what happened is the aircraft flying overhead must have had the same radio beam. So when the aircraft flew over, Lynn Lindquist's garage door, and Dad was pissing himself, you know. His mate with all the money and all the gadgets had his garage door flying open all the time. So blokes are like that to this day. We don't change, you know. So let's have a look at this next one. What have we got? This is our 1954 passport photo. The 4 Roberts boys leaving America for the first time. Look at my little brother down the front, the youngest. I mean, have you ever seen such a drop-dead, gorgeous toddler? But we came by sea, of course, everyone travelled by sea. And my little brother, even at that age, was already showing the form he would show on the Australian rules football field. The leap of a kangaroo and the courage of a lion. So my mother had him on a leather leash like a dog. And every time John would charge off to go for a swim in the Pacific, she'd hang on to it and say, "Gently, Bentley." It's an old saying. So the passengers on the Orange, they thought, "Oh, hello, Bentley." They thought it was no good Bentley. Yeah. So in 1957, we emigrated to Australia. Very, very big deal. It's coloured my thoughts on immigration, because even travelling from a very similar culture, United States, to Australia, I was homesick for years. And because the world was a bigger place, we weren't sending faxes, and an international phone call was a rare thing in 1957. But for years, Paul and I in particular, were homesick, and we would like to have gone back. So I think a lot of political talk nowadays is about immigration. I think for most people, if their homelands were peaceful and they'd get enough to eat and people would stop dropping bombs on them, would probably rather stay in their home countries with their traditions, with their families, with their religions, with their history. So really the true resolution of the immigration issue is to stop blowing everybody to bits, to have a peaceful and prosperous world, which is quite possible. The people who organise these wars know enough economic theory that it is quite possible for people to have a prosperous country of their own. The policies are there. They need to promote their economies rather than to exploit them. It has coloured my view. So in 1957, 1957 we went to school in Australia for the first time with deep American accents. And Australia in 1957 was not a cosmopolitan society. There were 3 immigrant kids in my class, in my grade 5 class. I was the American, Roland Weisfeld was the Dutchman, and Johnny Pecora was Austrian. And we used to walk home to school together. And Americans, as you know, are as thick as 2 planks. They don't have a sense of humour. They don't have the subtle British Australian sense of humour. So the Australian kids were pulling our legs a mile long, because they just wanted to hear us say, "No kidding, no kidding, gee." And the Australian kids would piss themselves. So in a couple of weeks, we lost our Australian accents. Yeah. So one of the things our what's the next picture? No, we'll go back. Okay. It's Tom's birthday yesterday. All 4 of us are still alive, which is, people are surprised because we've been fairly naughty in our time. One of our mother's many talents was the ability to cook a big meal for a dozen people on 5 seconds' notice, which is not easy. But she never complained. I think she enjoyed it because we had very interesting dinner guests. She had a few recipes standby that she could bulk up and keep frozen. One of them was called chicken tetrazzini, which she called chicken tetrachloride. And the recipe, which I wish I'd got from her, was Swiss steak. It's a braised, really nice. And her beef stroganoff was my favourite recipe of that dish. So Dad's big project every year was the summer school at the University of Western Australia. And there would be a theme, and you would have keynote speakers for a week. And one year his theme was politics. So the keynote speaker for the opposition, the Labor Party, was the young Gough Whitlam, who was deputy leader of the opposition at that stage to Arthur Call. This would have been early 1960s. So Dad didn't know anything about the Labor Party or the Liberal Party. He wasn't really interested in party politics. So I don't remember it being a particularly interesting dinner table Gough was in the Air Force, and so Mum did a bit of war talk. But Dad must have got on, later they must have got on to some more serious, international stuff, because Gough never forgot about it. But the keynote speaker for the government that year was Leslie Berry, who would B-U-R-Y, who was the Minister for Air would have been the Menzies government. And a very tall guy like Gough. And our mother purred like a pussycat. She told me afterwards he was the perfect dinner guest. Natural gentleman, easy conversation, just a top-class guy. Very charming. I remember him well. A gentleman. You don't find them in Canberra nowadays. But our mother was not always purring like a pussycat. When we had a VIP visitor who thought he was very important, she didn't just take the piss. She went for the jugular. We had to take her outside and put her under a sprinkler in the backyard for half an hour to cool her down before somebody called the FBI or the RSPCA or something. She was dangerous. And unfortunately, we all inherited this tendency, particularly the best occasion I ever had was in the north. It gets very hot in the north in the summer, so we don't, we've got the place to ourselves. But in the winter we get the best weather you can imagine, and it gets awfully cold and miserable in Canberra. So we get lots of visitors from the south to give us the benefit of their wisdom. And I would tell people, look, we don't just have a right to take the piss out of these people, it's our duty. And the best occasion arose when the House of Representatives Standing Committee on Aboriginal Affairs, the whole lot of them, rocked up to Australia in a bus. And I had been warned that the chair of this committee was convinced that Aboriginal communities were breeding grounds for terrorism. It was the funniest story I'd ever heard until the COVID story 20 years later. So I thought, if I'm training a bunch of terrorists here, I better look like a trainer. I was fit at the time, believe it or not, it was 20 years ago. So I put on a tight sort of shirt, cap, sunglasses, rugby shorts, boots, and we went down to meet this busload of Canberra honourable members. This was the era when, after 9/11, remember 9/11? Most of you old enough to remember 9/11. When those three heroic champions of democratic freedom, George W. Bush, John W. Howard, and Tony Bloody Blair, met up on George's ranch and under the full Texas moon, fell madly, deeply, passionately in love, and decided that their deeds for freedom would be to go to the Middle East and kill another million Muslims. So the bus rocked up at Middle Camp in Australia. It was the right place to be because Australia out of Port Hedland was where the Don McLeod's heroic strikers from 1946 wound up after their journey, their pilgrimage around the Pilbara, keeping themselves alive through alluvial mining, and set up the pioneering of Aboriginal language, the language centres, the Cocky Solomon's artwork, the whole, what we know about Aboriginal affairs today, they were the pioneers. So it was the right place for these learned honourable members to be. Anyway, the bus rocked up and they couldn't get out of it. The doors were locked by hydraulic or electronic malfunction or something. So there they were, surrounded by these savage terrorists, and they couldn't get out of this bus. So I'm striding around trying to look as mean as cat shit, trying to keep a straight face, because I haven't had somebody laugh since Mum called it tits in the bangle. And the driver got out through the hatch, and I drove her up to the house to use the phone. And she was laughing so much she pissed her pants, and I was laughing so much I could hardly stay on the road. And she rang the cavalry, and I got my axe. I had a beautiful Tasmanian axe. Went back to it, and I pointed at the bus door with this axe and said, "I'll open this bloody door." And I would like to think that the honourable members had skid marks on their underdecks. You like to give people value for money. Now we'll go again. This is HMAS Hobart, having been torpedoed in the Coral Sea in 1943. My mother's brother Bill was an officer on the Hobart. She was really knocked very badly damaged, as you can see. Another officer on the Hobart was Surtees Rothery, who was seconded from, he was a career merchant mariner. And after the war, and after he recovered from his injuries, he went back to the Merchant Marine. And when we were kids in Perth before television, we used to listen to the radio between 6:30 and 7, and there would be a report on the State Shipping Service. The Dolphin, under Captain Rothery, will berth at Carnarvon 0900 or so. It was a good service, the State Shipping Service. So was the ABC, believe it or not. And then we had a sports report from Jim Fitzmaurice and Ron Halcombe. You might remember, good fast bowler, Ron Halcombe. So that was before the news on the radio, before the 7 o'clock news. And later in my career, when I was cricket writing at the Wacker, in the members' stand, I would, on a Saturday Sheffield Shield game, I would sit next to Colin Wilkinson, who was the Sunday Times cricket writer, and directly in front of us were George Grulisich and Jim Fitzmaurice, calling the cricket for the ABC as it happened, which is not as easy as it looks. I should think football would be even harder, and the royal family of sports reporters are the race call, people who call the races. Doug Gilmore said they used to call the horses by their colours. He used to. But what amazed me about Jim Fitzmaurice and George Grulisich, as soon as the cricket stopped, they used to swear like sailors. Shocking, yeah. They turned every bloody word, and they turned the air blue. And I thought, gee, that's a high-risk occupation for blokes who are professional broadcasters. What if the microphone's still on? And that did happen famously with the ABC Children's Hour. It's a classic story. The guy who ran the Children's Hour on the ABC radio was, he didn't realise the microphone was still on. He said, "Thank God that gets rid of little bastards for another day." he was looking for another job, and I went to school with Sir Rothery's son, Peter, and last time I saw Pete, he was looking prosperous and looking after the books for West Farmers. Must have done a good job because West Farmers haven't gone broke. I don't think we're in trouble if West Farmers goes broke. But Pete and I used to ride our bikes home from school and stop at his mum's place for a cigarette, as you do. And I think Pete used to smoke Peter Stuyvesant, but I know that I smoked Marlboro because my grandfather was a director of Philip Morris Australia, and after he died, the company would continue to send complimentary cartons of cigarettes to his widow, our gran, Mina. There were a few packets of Philip Morris, an unfiltered cigarette, a good smoke, serious smoke, and there were packets of Marlboro, the filtered cigarette, which had the best television advertisement. The Marlboro advertisement was a bloke on a horse, a stockman. At the end of the day, he's got the herd of cattle quiet for the night, they've got plenty to drink, no more trouble expected, time for a smoke. On the saddle. I mean, how's a bloke going to give up smoking when they do ads like that? And the third packet of cigarettes was the green one, Alpine. They were a menthol cigarette, and they were Philip Morris's competition to the original Alpine cigarette, which was cool. spelt with a K, smoku. And Gran quite liked the menthol cigarettes. But when the carton arrived, Gran would give me a packet of Marlboro like so, and say, "Don't tell your mother." Now, they don't make like grandmothers like that anymore. I think they'd probably put her in jail. When the torpedo hit the Hobart in the Coral Sea, and not really surprising when you're in a warship in a war that you're going to get hit by a torpedo, it hit towards the stern. And to put the matter crudely, it blew her ass off. With a very, very fine piece of seamanship, the ship's crew ran monstrous hawsers, big steel hawsers around the stern and pulled it back together. And she was able to make port at Espiritu Santo at reduced speed, having lost a couple of propellers, under escort. Now, when the torpedo hit, the officers of the Hobart were doing exactly what you would expect them to be doing on a fine ship in the traditions of the Royal Navy. They were having a drink in the wardroom, which is located towards the end of the ship, towards the stern. The ship's medical officer used to make a dynamic cocktail using the ship's medicinal alcohol. Now, our Uncle Bill was known to take a drink, and he had happy memories of drinkies in the wardroom. Our sailing mate, Bill Brown, who served on North Atlantic destroyers in the early part of the war, it would have been in the Royal Navy, and later in the war was skippering motor torpedo boats around the West Indies, around the Caribbean. 3 Packard engines, port starboard midships. And on a glassy Caribbean night, when you put those full ahead, he reckoned that was really good fun. Now, Brownie reckoned that if you wanted to go upstairs in the Royal Navy, if you wanted to be Admiral of the Fleet, it didn't really matter if you didn't know one end of the ship from the other. Or as our Uncle Bill would say, if you didn't know a bowline from a bull's arse. But if you knew how to make the perfect pink gin, you were well on the way up to being First Sea Lord. When the torpedo hit the Hobart, Sir Rothery, my schoolmate's dad, was seated against the bulkhead. He was the closest bloke to the blast, and he was very badly hurt. Now, they needed to get a mathematician to count all his broken bones. And he was in such a deep coma that the medical staff weren't too sure he was going to come out of it. When he eventually came out, became conscious on the ship, his first words were, and this is the moral of my Uncle Bill's story, and this is the moral of all my stories, going back to that one I read out from year 11. His first words were, with his shattered skeleton, took him a long time to, they didn't think he'd ever walk again, but he did. His first words were, "What did the steward put in that drink?" That's the way we were. That's the way we like to think we are in Australia. We have no right to throw that away. We have no right to throw away our history, our culture, our character, everything we stand for. We have no right to hand over our country to a bunch of second-rate fox doctors, clerks at the World Health Organization, or to the usual slags who meet every year at Davos, or to the usual suspects in the City of London, or to the Wall Street wolves, or to the Chinese Communist Party, whoever is running this shit show, which has become so obvious in the last 6 years. Fuck them.
Working on
and fuck their local agents, our premiers, prime ministers, and the corporate, political, bureaucratic hierarchies who are not working for us. They're working for them. Fuck their poxy eyeballs. I was telling you about the greatest interviewer of them all, the German aristocrat, who interviewed all the aircrew, all my dad's colleagues. Actually, a lot of these guys didn't make it past the first part of the war. And an awful lot of the bomber crews died. I think it was 1 in 3. Bomber command were killed, at least. But his prisoners were brought in to be interviewed. But he didn't start his interview with electric shocks or herd them naked in front of savage dogs like those photographs we saw out of Iraq. Disgusting. And the psychologists who okayed that knew it wasn't going to work. They knew about it. This German guy's in the textbooks. He offered his prisoners, his interviewees, a cup of coffee. The finest, freshly roasted beans from South America. Just the aroma is enough to put you in a good mood. Then he offered them a cigarette, an American cigarette. And he chatted away and said, you know, I love your country, it's very beautiful and so on. And these are the smartest guys on earth, and they've been rigidly briefed not to talk, not to tell the Germans anything. Part of their training, because their senior officers knew they were going to be shot down. But people like to talk. And by the time he'd interviewed 100, he didn't try and get the last word out of every one, but by the time he'd interviewed a couple of hundred of these brilliant young men, he had drawn an accurate map of Britain's air defences. That's the secret. People like to talk. So there we were on the runway, I think it was off to the left of the airport at the old terminal in Perth. And there's Malcolm Fraser. God. And he saw us, and you could see he wasn't happy. We were not his favourite people, you know, the mild-mannered reporter and the photographer. So I walked quickly across the tarmac, introduced myself, shook hands, and said, "Welcome to Perth, Mr. Fraser." And he relaxed. He was so used to the Eastern States journalists sticking a microphone up his nose, if they could reach that far, and asking him when he stopped beating his wife, and having their ego trips, that he just relaxed, and we walked back to the terminal, across the tarmac there, and just chatted away. I had a story, it was good enough. He wasn't going to do the silly sort of stuff that Whitlam did, you know, trying to change the world even before he had a cabinet. Remember those first 100 days and the press conference Gough had with Lance Barnard? Just typical pig-headed sort of thing from Gough. Fraser would take his time. But the story was covered. And I was able to contact him later. People need to relax. It wasn't a page one story. The interview I did with Rex Connor, RFX Connor, the Minister for the Federal Minister for Energy and Resources, whatever it was, the third most controversial character leading to the dismissal of Whitlam. Rex Connor wanted to use our Northwest gas for Australian industry, whereas the Liberal government here wanted to export it. I'll talk about this some other time when we get back to, if we talk again about resources and defence and manufacturing industry pillar. It's one of the few subjects I know something about. Now that was a page one story, and it was was the best interview ever. I just enjoyed every minute of it with Rex Connor and Frank Crean. They came off the plane looking like 1950s Labor Party, double-breasted suits and hats. Fantastic. So I had the trifecta, really, come to think of it. I did an interview Sir John Kerr. I don't know if anyone did. Just have another couple of, the airport. I mean, the airport's a shithole now. I went there on Friday to meet Anna, and I nearly had a nervous breakdown just finding the car park and then finding my way to the place. Yeah, but the old airport was a happy hunting ground for reporters, cameramen and so on. And another lucky interview I had was when the English cricket team arrived at 1 o'clock in the morning, which was too late for the West Australian to do anything with it. So I had the first go, and I had a drink with Colin Cowdrey, Mr. MCC, in the upstairs bar at the airport, 1 o'clock in the morning. And he was absolutely charming. We'll give you another cricket story. I was writing the cricket for the Daily News the day Barry Richards, opening the batting for South Australia against Western Australia, hit 300 in one day. And he hit the first 100 before lunch, which was good. It means I had time to interview him before our deadline. And there we were, just two young blokes about the same age, sitting on the veranda of the Players' Pavilion at the Wacker. Barry was having a cup of tea. Cricketers drink a lot of tea. And gee, I was impressed. No, he was the best in the world. Bradman had him as his number one in his own all-time great team. And he wasn't remotely up himself. Just another young bloke, you know. Really made an impression on me. And one more cricket story. Again, I was at the Wacker in the lunch hour, and I ran into our photographer, Todge Campbell, who had his camera on the wing of the members' pavilion, looking straight down the wicket, big lens, and he was excited. And when Todge was excited, he was just jumping. He said, "Marshy's taking these catches down the leg side. I'm going to get him." He already envisaged his front page picture. And sure enough, that's the photograph you'll see in sportsmen's bars all around the world to this day. Rod Marsh at full stretch, parallel with the ground, taking this terrific catch. Now, Rodney Marsh was a West Australian of my vintage, my age, and all he ever wanted to do was play cricket for Australia. And he did. Did he ever? Yeah, great cricketer. Yeah. So for all the budding Clark Kents and Lois Lanes out there, that's what it's about. That's what the interview is about. It's not about you. It's not about your ego, your twirly-whirly curls that the weather girls wear now on television before they get pregnant and disappear. It's not about your smart-ass questions. You're the medium. You are the medium. And the story, your job is to sort of organise the story, but it's about the story. Find the story. Now, how you all going? Yeah, okay, look. I want to get to the complicated part of the story, and I always do. I want to talk about Australia because we've just had an election, and now all we're talking about is the next election. We're talking about a lot of party politics. It's 2 years before the next election. I'm not even. I suppose I've been sort of interested in politics all my life. My mother named me after Jeremy Bentham. But I sort of lifted it to another level, unfortunately, 40 years ago when we started on this neoliberal thing. And at that time, I remember having arguments about the issue of an Australian identity. The popular view is, I remember one colleague of mine, there's no such thing as an Australian identity. We're all part of a world economy now. We're just the same. We're all the same. We're going to the same shopping centres. We've got a few bob in our pockets and we go and buy stuff. So all this national stuff is passé, and I disagreed. And I think it is important to be an Australian. Let's just well, I might have missed something. Here we are. That's the Hobart, by the way, when she was in full swing. She was a light cruiser of the Leander class. She had 8 6-inch guns on twin turrets, 8 4-inch guns on twin mounts, 8 21-inch torpedoes, and the pom-poms and other crimes. She was 7,050 tons, 550 feet long, and a ship's company, as the Navy said, of 560 officers and other ranks. She's quite a ship. She sustained 29 knots when they were catching up with a convoy once, but the 30s rivalry reported. So she's a substantial vessel. Sister ship of the Perth and the Sydney. I think one of the American submarines is now 7,000 tons. A submarine the size of that ship. Yeah, I think it's crazy. Anyway. Well, there's been a few of them. That was from the before 30s, and she was. They were modified. The design was modified a bit for Australian service. A British design, Leander class. Yeah. The people who were on these destroyers and these ships said when they were going full bat, it's very exciting. The stern actually sinks down below the waterline, and you can see why they get hooked on it. But getting back to this question of who we are in Australia, the first of these lectures that I gave, I wanted to quote Vance Palmer from 1942. I couldn't find it. It was there in front of me. This is Vance Palmer writing in 1942, as I've just mentioned, Australia's darkest hour. Now, Vance Palmer is a familiar name for me because I think in our grade 7 English books, might have been edited by Vance Palmer, or maybe it was a poem in it. Anyway, a significant figure in the Australian literary educational field when I was a boy. And I'm indebted to Nicholas Gruen for this quote. And Nick Gruen is a very well-known economist, and it was actually Nick who took down one of my internet comments about the when I wrote these COVID measures. You remember all that stuff, lockdowns that had nothing to do with health, and he took it down. So I hope he's woken up, but I don't hold it against him. He's one of the good guys. This is Vance Palmer writing in 1942. There is an Australia of the spirit, submerged and not very articulate, born of the lean loins of the country itself, of the dreams of men who came here to form a new society. Sardonic, tongue-tied, perhaps, it has something to contribute to the world, not emphatically in the arts as yet, but in arenas of action and in areas and in ideas for the creation of that egalitarian democracy that will have to be the basis of all civilized societies in the future. I believe every word of that, and it's really what keeps me going. And it is the polar opposite of the way our societies and most other societies are going at the moment. greatly accelerated by the COVID project. We're heading into what Johannes Varoufakis calls techno-feudalism, a centralised, authoritarian, ugly society, increasingly censored by, that's one of the worst things about it, of course, by second-rate people. Have we ever seen such second-rate people?
Dr. Cook is very second rate.
Yeah, well, and
You're upgrading.
yeah. Yeah. So I do hold that there is an Australian identity. Can we go to this last one? That's what you're supposed to look like, gentlemen. Lean but powerful, fit and strong and proud. This photograph, for which I'm indebted to the Betty Library, was taken outside the Roman courthouse at the turn of the century, not this century, previous century. It's I'll wind this up here, but there are three, in my view, and not just my view, there are three deep pillars that go into the bedrock of the Australian continent that define who we are. One of them is the survival of the nomads, to borrow an expression from the historian Jeffrey Blainey. And the second great pillar is what I call the Lawsonian legend. It's the short stories of Henry Lawson, Joe Wilson and his mates, the short stories that Hemingway recommended to Scott Fitzgerald. And they're about battling through hard times, because Australia is a tough continent. 80% of Australia is arid or semi-arid rangeland. It's not this fool's paradise we have in Perth and suburban Perth. It is a rough country, and that is why we developed mateship, because the only way we can survive is by caring for one another. It's not a country for lords and lady mucks of the shithouse. We don't need them. The third great pillar is the terrible tragedy, appalling tragedy that destroyed us, really. We never recovered from it. We just lost too many young men at Gallipoli and in France. Too many young men. We never got back to where we were. We were never going to get back there. So we're going to have to get back to something else. But every year on Anzac Day, in this strange, it's a really complicated thing, Anzac Day. Shocking disaster, terrible loss, but it brings Australia together like nothing else. So in these three, this is the complicated part of it, but think about it. There are, in these three massive pillars, in the survival of our original people, despite all the shit we've given them in 200 years of white settlement, they're still here. Joe Wilson and his mates, and the Anzacs, that's who we are. Now, if we lose that, then we really are just a bunch of polyglot people going around shopping centres. I have two favourite comments, academic comments, on this issue of the Aborigines. After the Aboriginal issue has been on the fringes for 200 years of settlement, of our settler society, and there is a growing realisation among the elites too that it is actually central. So they're well intentioned, but they don't know much about it. I do know much about it, and my brother Paul knows much about it, and he has made two key documentaries on the two sides of the story. Firstly, the people who defied the settler society and retained their language and their culture and so on through Don McLeod's work in the 1946 strike. I have his documentary here, which is just brilliant. He has the actual people who were involved. And the second side of this issue, the key is the stolen people, the people who lost their culture and language and their families and are now looking for it. And he did a really beautiful documentary on that. I've got videos here that I'm not even sure if they're working, but anyway, whoever wants one can take it. I've just got a couple of them. Have a look at Australian society today. We're not really going all that well, are we? So these are the comments that they're from Karl Polanyi and Ian Tarrant. Karl Polanyi is the Hungarian intellectual who wrote one of the great books called The Great Transformation, published around the same time as The Road to Serfdom. It's one of my favourite books. He was a Hungarian intellectual with a magnificent command of language. This is from the Great Transformation. It's a famous book. You'll find it easily enough. And I can tell you with mathematical precision how much this has to do with AI and algorithms, whatever they are, and flying electric spaceships to Mars. Mathematical precision. 3/5 of 5/8 of fuck all. This is Karl Polanyi from The Great Transformation. For if one conclusion stands out more clearly than another from the recent study of early societies, it is the changelessness of man as a social being. The natural endowments reappear with a remarkable constancy in societies of all times and places, and the necessary preconditions for the survival of human society appear to be immutably the same. That's not bad for a bloke for whom English was not his first language. This is about our society. It's about the way we relate to it. And that's the challenge that Vance Palmer was talking about. And that's why people look to Australia with hope that we would develop this free society here in Australia. Nothing's stopping us. We're a huge island. We're surrounded by an ocean. We can build that society here. If we can't do it, nobody else has a chance. And Ian Tarrant, in his book Under the Kali Tree, I've got a couple of copies of that here, the anthropologist and teacher, the holistic worldview of the hunter-gatherer, the last people to retain survival values, is clearly the epitome of our humanity. Although our technical advances have been astounding, it is these old values, or the core of them at least, on which our survival depends. Now, what we're seeing worldwide here, we're seeing it every day on the television screens, are scenes that are remarkably reminiscent of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Why Americans and Europeans are in such a hurry to decline and fall is a subject of conjecture among economists who study financial markets. The point for Australia is that we don't have to decline and fall with them. Australia is well placed to adjust to the tectonic changes taking place in the world today, better placed than anyone, provided we remember who we are. We are not Americans, we are not Europeans, we're not Pongs, and we're not Asians. We're Australians. We have reached the climax of 3 great projects right now. The COVID project is on the eve of stage 6. Stage 6 of the COVID project is the central bank digital currency. It's what we thought all along this thing was heading for. It's where total Big Brother, our little mate, gets control of everything, including the money. That's why Pillow and everybody here for 5 years has been saying, use cash. The second great project, which has come to an end, thank goodness, is Greater Israel. This is the inherently absurd idea that a handful of European Jews can control the entire Middle East. It's over now, thank goodness, but it got this far because Meyer Lansky's mafia, the Kosher Nostra, owns the White House and the Congress. That is America's problem. That's not our problem. We do not have a dog in that fight. The Americans will solve this problem. They're not as stupid as they look. I was born and grew up in small town America. They're very capable people. They will sort it out. We don't need to get into it. The third project is the granddaddy of them all. It's called the Great Game. This is the foundation of the English education system, from boarding school to Sandhurst to Oxford. It is the idea that Britannia, perfidious Albion, can control the greatest landmass on Earth. Have a look at the map, Eurasia, through their agencies in the City of London. And to think that they can go on doing that now that China has industrialized is totally absurd, but they're still doing it. They've killed off a couple of million Ukrainians because part of the Great Game is to break up Russia and steal Russia's resources. That hasn't worked. So they're trying a second front in Armenia and Azerbaijan, and they're even trying to get the Germans to fight the Russians again. Now, you would think the Germans would have sent enough Russian soldiers at Stalingrad and the Kursk salient and in Berlin in 1945. Australia does not have a dog in any of these fights. None of these projects is our project. We should never have gone anywhere near the COVID project. We should never go anywhere near the World Health Organization. We spend a fortune on health and education. There are enormous budgets in Australia. Why bother training doctors and other health workers if we're putting them under control of a bunch of gangsters in Geneva who can declare a pandemic whenever it suits them? In Australia, our doctors and all our health workers, 750,000 health workers, are ruthlessly policed by a subdivision of organised crime called APRA. One of the speeches I made in St George's Terrace was outside the offices of APRA. I watched Richie's video. I was dressed up like a polar explorer. God, it was cold. St George's Terrace is not friendly to human beings. I guess that's why we're being replaced with robots or something. And but these are not our projects. If the rest of the world wants to play with this shit, go for it, boys and girls. Hopefully you're going to grow up and use your brains. But we just have this one project, the Australian project. And that is Vance Palmer's project. And people before him, my dad's dad, people have looked to Australia with hope, but inclusive this time of the original Australians, and not so bloody arrogant because we're not as clever as we think we are. We're making a right mess. But the creation on this country, the island, nation, continent of Australia, a place like nowhere else on earth, of an open, egalitarian society of free people. That's our mission. Thanks for listening, you guys.
Thank you, Jimmy. Does any member of the audience have any questions for Jerry?
Yeah.
Please come to the microphone.
Unfortunately, I'm driving. I could do with a stiff whiskey, I think. That's where is it?
Yeah, I just want to know what you thought about the real reason why Gough Whitlam was dismissed.
I'm not in any doubt about it. I think it was more to do with Rex Connor. It was the same reason. The same reason the Patrice Lumumba was killed. The same reason Salvador Allende was killed. Gough was lucky. He lived to a great old age. They didn't shoot him. But Jimmy Carter did apologise and said they wouldn't do it again, pig's ass. But it happens to anyone, including the Iranian revolutionaries. Anyone who tries to have a nation state that uses its own resources for its own people is going to be bulldozed one way or another. They didn't shoot Gough, and this gets back. It sort of gets back to Trump. And Trump's my age, and so I think that was the reason that the Australian government was trying to be a government for Australia. Rex Connor, the plan was to use that Northwest Shelf gas. This is going back. Remember, this is early 70s. So the people inside had information on just how big that resource was, the Woodside resource of Dampier. Now, Connor's plan was to pipe that gas around Australia and use it to build up Australian industry in Australia. The multinational corporations who, I mean, if you know how the world works, you know more than I do, but it's very much a corporate world at a high level. They wanted just to export the gas in massive ships, and so the gas went away to Korea and elsewhere to build up their industry. So it was. This is my view, considered opinion. That really, that's the real battle. The real battle is between any government, any group of people that wants to have a nation as a nation, and not to be just a mine for multinational corporations, is going to be targeted one way or another. So I think that's what the dismissal was all about. That's just my view, and I think I'd stick with it. There are other matters, but that's what it's about. It was about, and that continues to be this. And this is what Trump's all about. I think a lot of people supported Donald Trump, including me, because I supported Donald Trump for 10 years because I believed he was sincere about wanting to normalize relations with Russia. See, Trump's my age. We're baby boomers. She's right, and I mean, I'm too old to be president of the United States, and so is he. But the deep state, probably appeared to believe that Trump was serious about normalising relations with Russia. So in his first term, they cooked up this ridiculous bloody story about Russiagate, that Russiagate, got him the president. The Russian, just horseshit. So they were seriously worried. So all our lives, literally all our lives, we've had this Russophobia, this Cold War. Russia and the United States have built enough hydrogen bombs to blow the world to pieces, the moon, Jupiter and Mars as well. An insane waste of time, energy and money. Trump's a businessman. He wants to build a Trump Tower in Moscow. He wants to do business with them. But there's a huge vested interest going back to our major enemy, the City of London, to keep the world at war and keep everybody borrowing money to make more guns and more bombs and so on. So that's I think that's why some of us are still thinking about Trump, not altogether unfavourably. That he was quite open about it. There's an American school of economics going back to Alexander Hamilton and the German economist Friedrich List, which did use tariffs, which built up a national economy. They got some manufacturing going, transport, and so on. And we were heading in that direction in Australia too until the 1980s. The mixed economy, and the people that keep wanting to blow that up are the central bankers. We don't really know who. I mean, we know who's. Take the COVID project as part of this. The COVID project was designed to accelerate the centralised control of the individual of society, and to make us all sick with these bloody injections. And we know where it's coming from. We know who the messenger boys are, like Bill Gates, and who was involved with Epstein and so on. And I think that's also, I can't, I'm not pretending to understand all this, but I think what we see today, and why I'm not paying too much attention to Australian party politics, is that we have a government we can see, but there's a government we can't see, an international government. And that's the enemy. And what do you do about it? If you want to be really scared, listen to the economists who analyse the markets. They say, get to know your neighbours, especially the ones who grow vegetables and keep chooks. But that's, I'm pretty sure that's what happened. And I never asked Gough, but there was some work done on it by John Pilger, one of my colleagues in journalism, who traced it back to this apology from Jimmy Carter to Gough. They were scared about, because the old boys in Gough's cabinet were pretty silly. They were talking tough about what's the big base in the Northern Territory. Come on, Ollie. Pine Gap, yeah, threatening to close down Pine Gap, and that scared the Americans. And people were still looking for Russians under the bed, elderly communists with whiskers. That's before we started looking for Arabs, and before we started closing the door in case the dreaded COVID lurgy came underneath and got in the window. Always trying to scare us with something. So don't get scared, get angry, and keep your cool, and just be on the lookout for anybody who's speaking up for Australia as a nation.
Question about this recently about that apparently Australia could be self-sufficient in oil, and that we used to have, I think it was 5 refineries. Yeah, I'm not sure, but so this same reason that they want to stop us from being self-sufficient is why with the governments that we've had in recent years, that they're basically giving in to whoever's the up top government.
Yeah, that's quite clear. We saw that it was spectacular in the COVID project, if you recall. I mean, that's what we're all trying to find out. Who was telling Mark McGowan what to do and when to do it? Closing borders and this ridiculous shit. Nothing to do with health. Every state had a pandemic plan. Yeah, well, but so they're working with someone else. And we never found out who told Mark McGowan what to do. Who told Scott Morrison to form a national cabinet? You won't find that in the Constitution. Who told Scott Morrison to personally take on all those portfolios? Remember that story? The whole bloody lot. And Scott's not going to say. He just smiled. He's under orders. So we don't know. And the freedom movement, the people here for the last 5 years, We came together originally because of a civil liberties emergency, the COVID poison death shots. And what's happened since, without that overhanging urgency, the freedom movement's gone off in all sorts of different directions, which is entirely reasonable because people have different ideas about religion, politics, race, economics, culture. So I hope we can agree to disagree amicably on these matters, which are comparatively unimportant, and just stick together on basic principles. Free speech, medical freedom. We can't have pipsqueak politicians that's telling us to be injected with the latest crap, and cash, an anonymous currency. So I don't think we're going to solve these problems. I don't think we're going to work it out. And of course, the people who go into the history of masonry and so on, if it's been going for a couple of thousand years, I think our chances of stopping it are not high. So I think that for me, the focus has to be on our Australian society. No matter what they do out there, we have these principles of freedom here, and we've thrown them away. We better get them back. We can't have people censoring how we talk or telling us where to stand in the street. This all started. The idea for this lecture came to me when we'd already worked out, say, first quarter of 2022, that all our institutions were rotten. But we continued having our marches. Remember the marches around Perth? We were wearing out shoe leather, getting fit, losing weight. And we were having a cup of coffee at Al's place in Pier Street. And you were there, Richie, Scotty, Robin, Alan, Andrew. And Scotty said, I wonder if we can get a media pass to go to one of Mark McGowan's media conferences. You remember Mark McGowan's media conferences? Every second day, not just Mark, all the premiers, the chief executive of the state is telling us where we're allowed to stand on the street, if we're allowed to stand on the street, if we're allowed to take off our masks to have a cup of tea. I don't remember. I didn't see anybody actually trying to eat a scone, jam and cream through a mask, but it would not have surprised me. Now, the idea of Scotty going to one of Mark McGowan's press conferences was really good. We would have given him a huge breakfast, lots and lots of baked beans. I advised him to get a chair with a wooden base. Plastic's all right, but you can't beat wood for resonance. And by the time of question time, Scotty would have ripped off the biggest fart of the century, a symphony in 4 moves. And then he could have said to Mr. Premier, that was more of a statement than a question. I must have been to dozens of media conferences in my time, but the only one I remember was when Billy McMahon was Prime Minister and he was campaigning in Perth. So all the hotshots from Canberra were here. And they were asking their hotshot question, and Billy McMahon couldn't hear very well. So the hotshots were asking all these super duper questions, and Billy McMahon couldn't hear them. It was like one of those comedy shows. I think to have a memorable media conference, it has to be good fun. And Mark McGowan really, he took off. There was a stage when Mark was leaving the button undone on his expensive Italian suit, and he was coming into the media conference, whirling around and spraying this jacket around like a toreador. He'd obviously been spending too much time sunbaking in the nude on the roof of Parliament House in West Perth. They all do it. It's not a pretty sight. And so Mark's you're allowed to have fun when you're taking the piss out of politicians. It's compulsory. So Mark's minders got in touch with me and they said, look, we're worried about Mark. He's having an identity crisis. He has forgotten whether he's supposed to be Napoleon Bonaparte, Adolf Hitler, or Attila the Hun. I said, don't worry about that. Don't worry about that. That's normal. If Mark didn't think he was Jesus Christ on wheels, he would not be Premier. So I said, just be pragmatic. Just tell Mark that if he catches the inside pocket on his expensive jacket on the doorknob of the press conference room and goes arse over tit in front of the cameras of 7 nightly news, he's going to look a right dog. So Mark got out of that one. But that's when I started thinking about this lecture, because media conferences are not really much use. You probably noticed the mainstream media at these media conferences have small brains, big egos, and big mouths. The politicians or whatever who run them know what they want to say, and they know what they don't want to say. So you're not going to learn much. So that's why we get back to the interview. So look, there's a lot of speculation about what the hell's going on in the world. Between Russia, China, United States, Zurich, City of London. I keep an eye on it, but for me, the focus has to be on the freedoms of our society within Australia. And there's no need for us to do as we're told by these international bodies. No, nothing's stopping us having our own policies internally, having a healthy, happy, free country. That's something we can do. And as far as those countries are concerned, as far as the superpowers are concerned, there is clearly a major change happening in the world. The future of Australia is entirely dependent on maintaining solid relationships with Russia, China, and Iran. And the future of the United States is clearly dependent on maintaining those relationships with Russia, China, and Iran. And nobody knows that better than Donald Trump. So his problems are internal in his country with the people who've corrupted his country. We don't want them corrupting our country too. To hell with the bastards. That's why we're here. That's why we're here at Topolini's. It's great fun, isn't it? Yeah, it's lovely being here with you guys. I enjoy it. Yeah. Time to go? Yeah, lovely.
Thank you.